She's a pathetic burden and a constant drain on my resources. He sneered at his heavily pregnant wife on their anniversary. He didn't bring flowers, no champagne toast, just calculated cruelty delivered in front of Washington's financial elite. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just smiled, calm, graceful, utterly unshaken. And then she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. What she said next was the only thing that could instantly strip the power from a billionaire's eyes. Before we continue with the story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Oh, and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We love seeing that. Doris Brown had bankrupted corporate empires before her morning coffee. But when Anthony Tudor smiled at her across that charity gala 5 years ago, she made the most dangerous decision of her life. She chose to let him think he was the empire builder. The crystal chandeliers of the Tudor estate ballroom refracted light across 200 of Washington's most powerful faces, and Doris Brown Tudor stood at the center, like the eye of an approaching storm. Her Valentino gown in midnight blue draped carefully over her visibly pregnant form, and her dark eyes held the kind of quiet intelligence that made Wall Street titans reconsider their quarterly reports. At 32, she was the daughter of the legendary Brown family. Old money so discreet that Forbes had stopped trying to estimate their worth 3 generations ago. MIT educated with a dual degree in financial analytics and applied mathematics that she'd earned summa cum laude before her 23rd birthday. Ladies and gentlemen, Doris's voice cut through the champagne-fueled chatter like silk over steel. Thank you for supporting the Tudor Foundation's work in early childhood education. Your generosity changes lives. Across from her, Anthony Tudor commanded the room with the presence of a man who'd clawed his way from Philadelphia row houses to a $12 billion real estate empire. 38 years old, sharp-featured with that particular brand of self-made arrogance, wearing a custom Brioni tuxedo that announced his arrival into old money circles. His ice-blue eyes surveyed the crowd with the satisfaction of a predator who'd claimed the best territory. My beautiful wife is too modest. Anthony's voice carried bourbon-smooth confidence as he took the microphone from her hand without asking. While she plays with charity checkbooks, the real work of building this family's legacy falls to those of us actually creating wealth in the marketplace. Doris has her little foundation, her useless MIT degree gathering dust while she manages donation receipts. The ballroom temperature plummeted. Senator Patricia Whitfield, seated near the stage, set down her wine glass with audible force. This was meant to be a celebration of their 5th anniversary, not public warfare. 3 investment bankers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A tech CEO's wife whispered something sharp to her husband, but Doris didn't explode. Instead, she smiled. The same expression her great-grandfather, railroad magnate Harrison Brown, had worn while quietly purchasing every competing line before announcing his monopoly. The same look her mother displayed when restructuring hostile takeovers without the target company realizing until the paperwork was signed. Anthony. Doris's voice dropped to that dangerous register between courtesy and consequence. I graduated summa cum laude from MIT with dual degrees in financial analytics and applied mathematics. I spent 6 years as the youngest senior analyst at Goldman Sachs, restructuring distressed assets worth $40 billion. My family has been building financial dynasties since before your great-grandparents learned what a bank account looked like. She paused, one hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly, letting each word settle like stones in still water. The smile never left her face, but her eyes held the cold precision of someone calculating the exact moment of demolition. 5 years earlier, Doris had walked into the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur fundraiser, wearing a simple black sheath dress that cost less than the champagne being served. Yet every head turned when she entered. Anthony Tudor spotted her standing alone, studying the ancient Egyptian architecture with the focused intensity most people reserved for profit margins, and made his approach with the calculated confidence of a man who'd never been refused. Most people pretend to appreciate the art, he'd said, handing her a glass of Dom Perignon she hadn't asked for. You actually see it. She'd turned those dark, intelligent eyes on him and smiled. Not the practiced smile of a socialite, but something genuine and slightly amused. Most people pretend to build empires. You actually did. He was hooked instantly. Not by her beauty, though she was striking in that understated way, old money perfected over generations. Not by her pedigree, though the Brown name opened doors even his billions couldn't breach. He was captivated by the way she listened when he spoke about vertical integration strategies, asking questions that revealed a mind sharper than half his executive board. 6 months later, he proposed at 11 Madison Park, between the 7th and 8th courses. "Build something with me," he'd said, and she'd believed he meant partnership. The Tudor Foundation had been Anthony's tax strategy, nothing more. But when Doris took the reins after their wedding, walking away from her Goldman Sachs partnership without hesitation, she transformed it into something that actually mattered: early childhood education initiatives, STEM programs for underserved communities. Real impact, not just photo opportunities. What Anthony never knew was that Doris had simultaneously created the family escrow account, a Byzantine legal structure, using $200 million of her inheritance, technically joint property but coded with triggers only a forensic accountant would notice. Half funded the foundation's legitimate work, the other half disappeared into a quantum computing venture Anthony dismissed as science fiction for trust fund kids. Now, 5 years later, Doris stood in their Kalorama Mansion's marble bathroom at 3 a.m, one hand on her swollen belly, the other steadying herself against cold stone. Through the bedroom door, she could hear Anthony on a conference call with Tokyo, his voice animated with the thrill of the chase. He hadn't asked about her doctor's appointment that afternoon. Hadn't noticed she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring because her fingers were too swollen. She caught her reflection in the mirror and recognized the truth she'd been avoiding. He'd never wanted a partner. He'd wanted a pedigree. 3 weeks before their anniversary, Doris woke at 2 a.m. to find Anthony's side of the bed empty again. She padded downstairs to his study, intending to leave him the prenatal vitamin prescription her doctor had asked him to pick up, and found his laptop still glowing on the mahogany desk, abandoned mid-spreadsheet when he'd rushed to take a call in the garden. She shouldn't have looked. That's what she told herself later, when the guilt tried to surface. But her analyst's eye caught the numbers first. The impossible deficit buried 3 layers deep in Tudor Properties' Q3 projections, and instinct took over. 20 minutes of forensic examination revealed the hemorrhaging. Anthony's flagship Miami development had underwater financing. His Seattle high-rise was bleeding cash from cost overruns he'd hidden from the board. The Phoenix project was collateralized 3 times over to different lenders, a shell game that would make Enron executives nervous. But it was the wire transfer notation that stopped her breathing. Collateral X-Fear. TFE Act. 7. 2M. The family escrow account. Her family's escrow account. Her hands moved with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, pulling up her own encrypted files, tracing the digital footprints Anthony had tried to erase. He'd used her account as collateral for a $47 million bridge loan to cover the Miami disaster, forging her electronic signature on documents her family's attorneys had specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of theft. Worse, the loan was structured through 3 Cayman Island entities. Classic money laundering architecture. The betrayal was molecular. He hadn't just stolen from her, he'd stolen from their child's future, leveraged their family's century-old reputation to cover his failures, and committed federal crimes using her inheritance as the vehicle. Doris sat in the dark study until sunrise, her hand resting on her belly where their daughter kicked against her palm, and did the math with the cold clarity her MIT professors had praised. The escrow documents included automatic default provisions. Any unauthorized use triggered immediate reversion of control and asset freeze. Anthony had just legally handed her his empire without realizing it. She drafted the activation papers herself, using her mother's attorney to file them sealed with the D.C. Superior Court. The freeze would execute in 21 days, precisely at midnight, on their anniversary. Then she called the party planner and confirmed every detail of their celebration. She wanted witnesses for what came next. The Tudor estate ballroom glittered with 200 of Washington's most influential faces, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across silk gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Doris stood near the dessert table, one hand pressed against the small of her aching back, the other resting on her belly where her daughter had been kicking relentlessly for the past hour. 8 months pregnant in Valentino heels was its own special form of warfare. She watched Anthony work the room with the fluid confidence of a man riding high on champagne and quarterly earnings reports that existed only in his imagination. He'd already had 4 glasses. She'd counted. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anthony's voice boomed as he commandeered the microphone from the string quartet's break. 5 years with the incomparable Doris Brown Tudor. The applause was polite, anticipatory. Anniversary toasts were supposed to be romantic. My wife, he continued, his words slightly slurred, gesturing toward her with theatrical expansiveness, has dedicated herself so completely to our foundation, managing donation receipts, hosting fundraiser luncheons, putting that fancy MIT degree to use organizing charity galas. He laughed, and several guests shifted uncomfortably. While she's been playing philanthropist, some of us have been actually building wealth, creating empires. But everyone needs a hobby, right? Even if that hobby is being a pathetic burden and constant drain on my resources. The ballroom went silent. Senator Whitfield's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. A tech CEO whispered something sharp to his wife. 3 investment bankers stared at their shoes. Doris didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Instead, she smiled, the same serene expression her great-grandfather had worn while quietly destroying railroad competitors, and walked toward her husband with the unhurried grace of someone who held all the cards and knew it. She reached him at the microphone, close enough that only he could hear. The smile never left her face as she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of empires shifting. You just defaulted on the escrow account, Anthony. And I have the wire transfer records. His face went white, then gray. Understanding hit him like a freight train. Doris turned, the crowd parting instinctively as she walked toward the exit, heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision. She didn't look back. Behind her, she heard the first phone buzz, then another, and another. The financial tsunami was already starting, at 12:01 a.m. While Anthony stood in the empty ballroom staring at his phone with trembling hands. The escrow account freeze executed with the mechanical precision of a bank vault slamming shut. Every asset he'd cross-collateralized, every property deed he'd used as secondary backing, every line of credit that touched the family escrow account became instantly, legally frozen, by 2 a.m. His general counsel was pounding on the bedroom door of his Bethesda home, shouting about cascading margin calls. Tudor Properties credit lines had been pulled simultaneously by 4 different lenders. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. What Anthony didn't know was that 3 of those 4 lenders were shell corporations controlled by the Brown family's network, patiently waiting for exactly this trigger. The 4th was Goldman Sachs, where Doris's former mentor had received an anonymous tip about potential fraud 3 weeks prior, complete with preliminary documentation. At 4:47 a.m., Anthony's CFO called from a burner phone, voice cracking with panic. The Cayman accounts had been flagged by FinCEN. Someone had provided the Treasury Department with complete transaction records showing the money laundering architecture he'd built to hide the Miami losses. Anthony knew exactly who that someone was. At 6:03 a.m., 12 FBI agents and 4 IRS investigators arrived at the Tudor estate with warrants for both premises and person. They'd been building the case for 3 weeks, ever since an anonymous package had arrived at the Financial Crimes Unit, containing wire transfer records, forged authorization documents, and a forensic analysis so thorough it must have been prepared by someone with Goldman Sachs-level expertise. Special Agent Morrison read him his rights while 2 agents seized his laptop, the same one he'd left unattended that night 3 weeks ago. Tax fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, corporate racketeering. Each charge carried years. As they walked him out in handcuffs, Anthony caught a glimpse of the Washington Post on his doorstep. Below the fold, a smaller headline. Brown family heiress announces major tech investment, new company launch. The photo showed Doris, radiant and visibly pregnant, shaking hands with the governor of Maryland at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The caption identified her as CEO of Quantum Dynamics, a stealth-mode computing venture capitalized at $200 million. He'd never even asked what she did with her inheritance. Anthony Tudor spent his first week in federal detention learning that money couldn't buy respect when you had none left to spend. The Wall Street Journal ran his mugshot above the fold. CNBC dedicated an entire segment to his fall. By day 3, his attorneys had crafted 17 different plea strategies, each more desperate than the last. The divorce papers arrived on day 5, delivered by a process server who seemed to enjoy his work a little too much. Doris Brown Tudor versus Anthony James Tudor. Grounds: financial crimes, moral turpitude, and irretrievable breakdown of marriage. Her signature was neat, contained, final. 2 weeks later, At 3:47 a.m., in George Washington University Hospital's private wing, Doris brought Eleanor Margaret Brown Tudor into the world. Named for her great-great-grandmother, the woman who'd turned a small railroad investment into an empire, while her husband thought she was simply managing household accounts. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family history. Doris held her daughter against her chest, studying the tiny, perfect face, and felt something settle into place. Not revenge. Justice had a different weight, cleaner and more permanent. By Eleanor's 6-week birthday, Doris had made her first public appearance as CEO of Quantum Dynamics. The TechCrunch profile called her the stealth architect of quantum computing's next revolution. Forbes estimated the company's valuation at $800 million, built entirely from the inheritance Anthony had tried to steal. The irony made headlines for weeks. Anthony's lead attorney, Marcus Webb from Covington and Burling, requested a meeting at the federal courthouse. He showed up with a junior partner and a briefcase full of settlement proposals, each one attempting to trade Doris's testimony for reduced sentencing. "Mrs. Tudor," Webb began, his voice carrying the careful deference of a man who knew he was outmatched. "My client understands the gravity of his mistakes. He's asking, respectfully, if there's any possibility of your cooperation with his defense. Perhaps a character witness statement, or reconsideration of the civil filings. He's willing to negotiate any terms." Doris looked at him across the conference table, Eleanor sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside her chair. She thought about the wire transfers, the forged signatures, the casual cruelty of being called a burden while carrying his child. "Justice," she said. Then she stood, collected her daughter, and walked out. The judge delivered 15 years without visible emotion. Though everyone in the courtroom understood it was lenient given the charges, Anthony stood as the sentence was read, his Brioni suits replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit that didn't fit properly, and heard his entire empire reduced to restitution schedules and asset liquidation timelines. The Miami property sold at auction to cover the first wave of creditors. The Seattle high-rise went to a Chinese investment group. The Phoenix project was seized by the bank. What little remained after settling the fraud claims was placed into a newly established trust. The Eleanor Brown Foundation for Early Childhood Education, administered by Doris's family attorneys and bearing absolutely no connection to the Tudor name. He'd built a $12 billion empire in 18 years. It was dismantled in 6 months. FCI Cumberland's medium security facility in Maryland became his new address, a place where nobody cared that he'd once closed deals with senators or had dinner with tech billionaires. Here, he was inmate 47832-004, assigned to the prison library because his financial skills were considered too dangerous for the business office. It was in that library, 14 months into his sentence, that Anthony found the Fortune magazine someone had left on the periodicals table. The cover showed Doris in a charcoal suit, Eleanor on her hip, standing in front of Quantum Dynamics' new headquarters in Reston. The Dynasty Builder, how Doris Brown created a quantum computing empire, while her husband wasn't looking. He read the article 3 times, his hands shaking by the end. The venture had started 5 years ago, funded entirely by her inheritance. She'd recruited MIT's top quantum physicists, filed 18 patents, built partnerships with DARPA and the NSA, all while he'd dismissed her intelligence as decorative, her degree as useless, her mind as something that existed only to make him look good at dinner parties. The photograph showed her in a board meeting, explaining complex computational theory to a room full of scientists who looked at her with respect, real respect, not the patronizing acknowledgement he'd offered when she'd tried to discuss his failing Miami numbers. He'd never wanted her brilliance. He'd wanted her compliance. Eleanor, now almost 2 in the photo, had her mother's eyes. Those same dark, intelligent eyes that had watched him destroy himself, while she quietly built something that mattered. 3 years after his sentencing, Anthony walked out of FCI Cumberland with $47 in gate money, a bus ticket to Baltimore, and a parole officer's business card. Good behavior had shaved 2 years off his sentence, though he suspected the federal prison system simply wanted the bed space. Ex-billionaires didn't generate sympathy from parole boards, but they also didn't cause trouble. The halfway house in Fells Point smelled like industrial cleaner and broken promises. His roommate was a former accountant who'd embezzled from a church. They didn't talk much. Anthony spent his first week of freedom filling out applications for jobs that required him to check the convicted felon box, watching potential employers' expressions shift from consideration to polite dismissal. He finally found work at a Whole Foods in Harbor East, stocking shelves for $15.50 an hour. The irony of organizing organic produce in a neighborhood where he'd once closed a $200 million mixed-use development deal wasn't lost on him. Neither was the fact that his shift supervisor was 23 and called him Pops. On his lunch break 2 months into parole, Anthony sat in the break room with a turkey sandwich and found a Wall Street Journal someone had left behind. The headline stopped him mid-bite. Quantum Dynamics valuation hits $50. Billionaire's Defense Department signs exclusive contract. The photo showed Doris shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. Eleanor, now 5 years old, stood beside her mother wearing a small navy dress, the same composed expression already forming on her face. The article called Doris the Dynasty Builder, describing how she'd quietly revolutionized quantum encryption while the tech world was distracted by social media and cryptocurrency. The reporter had done deep research. Quantum Dynamics employed 4,000 people, held patents that would define computing for the next generation, had created technology that made her one of the most strategically important people in American national security. She'd testified before Congress twice, advised 3 presidents, and turned down acquisition offers from every major tech company on Earth. The article mentioned Anthony only once, in passing. Doris Brown, formerly married to disgraced real estate developer Anthony Tudor, formerly married, disgraced, past tense. He read the final paragraph 3 times. When asked about her success, Brown credits her MIT education, her family's legacy of patient capital, and her daughter Eleanor, who she says reminds her daily why building something that matters is worth more than building something that simply looks impressive. Anthony folded the newspaper carefully and returned to stocking shelves. Anthony waited in the lobby of Quantum Dynamics' Reston headquarters for 47 minutes before her assistant finally called his name. The building was all glass and steel, designed by someone who understood that power didn't need to announce itself. Security had made him surrender his phone and sign 3 NDAs just to enter. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than his sentencing hearing. Doris's office overlooked the Dulles Technology Corridor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing an empire he'd never known she was building. She stood behind her desk in a slate-gray suit, her hair shorter now, sharper, the softness he'd taken for granted completely absent. She didn't invite him to sit. "You have 15 minutes, she said. "My next meeting is with the Joint Chiefs." Anthony had rehearsed this conversation for 6 months, but every word felt inadequate standing in front of her. "I came to apologize. Not because my parole officer suggested it, or because I want something, because you deserve to hear that I understand what I did. Go on. I spent 5 years married to absolute genius and treated you like decorative furniture. I called your MIT degree useless while you were building technology that's reshaping national defense. I called you a burden while you were carrying our daughter and funding quantum computing breakthroughs." His voice cracked slightly. "My arrogance wasn't just monstrous, it was pathological. I destroyed everything because I couldn't stand the idea that you were smarter than me." Doris studied him with those same dark, analytical eyes that had once looked at him with something resembling affection. Now, they held only cool assessment. "You've learned humility," she said finally. "Prison tends to teach that lesson effectively. You're working an honest job, staying clean, following your parole requirements. That's admirable, Anthony. Genuinely." Something in her tone made him realize this wasn't acceptance. "But you've done the bare minimum to earn back your own self-respect," Doris continued, her voice carrying the same silk over steel quality he remembered from the anniversary party. "You haven't even begun to earn back mine. Self-awareness of your failures isn't the same as understanding what you destroyed. You noticed your arrogance. Congratulations. A functional adult should have noticed that before committing federal crimes." She glanced at her watch. "Your 15 minutes are up." Anthony returned to Quantum Dynamics 6 months later, this time with an invitation. Doris's assistant had sent it to his halfway house, dinner at her Georgetown brownstone. Eleanor would be staying with her grandmother for the evening. He arrived with flowers from the Eastern Market. Nothing extravagant, just seasonal tulips that seemed appropriate for someone who had no right to assume anything. Doris answered the door herself, wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater. looking more relaxed than he'd seen her in years. Maybe ever. "Come in," she said. "I'm not going to poison you." Over dinner, they talked carefully around the history between them, discussing Eleanor's kindergarten achievements, Doris's upcoming Senate testimony on encryption standards, Anthony's community college courses in sustainable agriculture. It felt almost normal. If normal could exist between two people who'd destroyed and rebuilt themselves in each other's wreckage. "I've been thinking," Doris said over coffee, her tone shifting into something more deliberate. "About second chances. About what forgiveness actually requires versus what it permits." Anthony set down his cup, waiting. "My family's estate in Virginia needs proper management. 200 acres, historic property, significant upkeep. It could be a working farm again with the right vision." She paused, watching his reaction. "It could also be a home for Eleanor on weekends. A place where she knows both her parents." Understanding crystallized slowly. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something that matters, on terms that reflect reality." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "I am the power, Anthony. I am the name. I will shape the future of quantum computing, of our daughter's legacy, of everything we build from this point forward. You will celebrate that, support it, and never, ever, try to diminish me again." She stood, walking to where he sat. "If you can accept that, truly accept it, then we can rebuild. Not what we had, something honest." Anthony knelt, the gesture feeling less theatrical than inevitable. "I spent 5 years trying to make you small enough to fit my ego. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to rise to your level." Doris's hand touched his shoulder, and when she leaned down, her whisper carried the weight of empires shifting. "Welcome to my reign, Anthony. Try to keep up." Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.